As a firm who has spent many years advising business owners on how to structure their estates to maximize what they can pass on to the next generation, we're well placed to see the impact that the recent budget has had on business owners and including people who own farms. Um, Generally, the approach when we look at succession planning, when we're looking at inheritance tax specifically, is everybody has a base level that they can pass on tax free. Generally, we will allow that as their home, so people will be able to pass on their home tax free. Then we have to look at every other component of their estate to identify whether it's going to come into the estate for inheritance tax and how we then have to plan for that asset. Typically, pensions have been outside of the estate for inheritance tax. We haven't needed to plan for that asset. And businesses have been outside of the estate for inheritance tax. We haven't needed to plan for that asset. Farms have been outside of the estate for inheritance tax. We haven't needed to plan for that asset. The recent budget has brought those assets back into the estate, which means for most people, the tax-free allowance will be exceeded. So most people are now going to fall into inheritance tax, where previously they may not have done. And specifically now, we need to give specific attention to businesses, farms, because where there wasn't inheritance tax before, there is inheritance tax now. So if you have a business or a farm, any trading business with a valuation exceeding £1 million, now you're going to be levied inheritance tax at the rate of 20%. It's a significant inheritance tax that previously just did not exist. So now everybody has the need to think about that eventuality. If you have a business, let's say its valuation is £2 million, that does not mean you have £2 million sitting in the bank. Most businesses, if they get hit for a 20% tax above 1 million, £200,000 on £2 million, they do not have £200,000 sitting in the bank. They don't have those kind of capital reserves. So businesses and individuals who own businesses suddenly need to do planning because there's a significant tax burden. And in order for that business to survive, to be passed down to the next generation, sensible plans will need to be put in place. So, and this really does speak to the relationship that you develop with your professional advisors. Um, Most people who work in our industry, they do relatively straightforward estate planning. They do wills, they do lasting powers of attorney. They may do some work with trusts, and it's good practice to review those documents every 3 years. Um, the reality is that most people don't. Most people, you made a will 10 years ago when you had your children, and you haven't looked at it since. There's going to be a lot of changes over the last 10 years that impact on things like your inheritance tax position. Um, Structures that you might include in your will that change over time, how you use trust structures in your will, whether they're still relevant or whether there are different ways that we use them today than people used them 20 years ago. So it's a very good idea to have things like wills reviewed at least every 3 years. Um, when you get into the more complex estate planning, you should really have a review every year. There are going to be changes every year in terms of tax legislation, um, but also in terms of your priorities, your relationships, your family relationships, your business relationships, your interests in terms of how you're investing, how you're building. Um, the market will change. We do a lot of work with people who invest in property, and there are lots of different property investment strategies that can help people to get a really good return on their properties and on how they invest. And those strategies will have golden moments where they make a really good return, and then they'll go out of fashion. But there will be other strategies, other things that you can pick up, other ways that you can make money in property. So it's always a good idea to be really on top of things and review your circumstances every year. Um, Look at the financial services industry as a comparison. Um, Previously, 20 years ago, a financial advisor was more of a salesman. He was out to sell you a pension. He was out to sell you some life insurance. These days, it's a very regulated industry. Uh, all of the advisors have taken exams. They're all qualified. They're all regulated. They all follow a code of conduct in terms of how they're offering advice to clients. They're advisors, they're not salesmen. Um, what that does is it really tightens up how you get financial advice. Uh, you will sit down with your financial advisor every year, minimum. You might sit down with your financial advisor every 6 months, maybe even every 3 months if you have enough going on to warrant it. So why do you want to sit down with your will writer every 10 years? Um, we deliver a service where we're working with complex estates, people who are really building assets, building capital, who will have sort of fingers in lots of pies in terms of different sort of types of assets that they're working with. And we offer services where we will sit down with them every single year to review their succession plan and make sure that it's optimized for their circumstances, optimized for their family, and optimized for what they want to achieve. If business owners haven't looked at this, business owners need to get in touch right away and start to understand the impact this has had. Before the budget, businesses were able to be passed on completely free of tax from parents to children. Now there is a 20% tax on everything above £1 million. So if you have a business that today has a valuation above £1 million or potentially could have a valuation above £1 million, you need to get in touch right away and start to think about how you plan for the fact that your business could have a 20% tax on it. That the pension changes are actually the biggest impact that will impact on the most people. Before now, everyone has a tax-free allowance they can pass on, and generally, if you own your home, you're either above that allowance or you're coming pretty close to that allowance. Now, what's happened is the government have brought pensions into the estate for inheritance tax. So previously, if you owned your home and you owned your pension, you might be just under that allowance. Now, because you own your home and you own your pension, suddenly you could come into the threshold for inheritance tax where previously you never did before. Now that's going to be a lot of families in the UK, homeowners who have a pension. Suddenly there could be hundreds of thousands of pounds of inheritance tax where previously there was none. So I think everybody needs to get advice to make sure that they're prepared for that eventuality.